Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, all of you, Excellencies, partners. It's a real pleasure to welcome you today to the launch of the IDMC and ADB's report on disaster displacement in the Asia-Pacific region, but also to IDMC's annual conference with a very special focus this year on disaster and climate-related displacement. We're delighted to see so many of you here today in person. I'd also like to welcome all our participants who are joining online on Zoom. So for those of you on Zoom, I hope you can hear me and see me well. And just to inform you that there's an option on your screens to ask questions throughout the day, throughout this morning's session. You can do it by using the Q&A function on the Zoom screen. Before we dive in, I would like to say a few words about this year's thematic focus of our conference. For us, this focus symbolizes the progress that we have made as an institution, as IDMC, in better measuring and understanding the scale of internal displacement across the world. You may be aware that IDMC is preparing to celebrate its 25th anniversary next year. So a quarter of a century of work. We really feel that there's a certain sense of accomplishment as we look back on how our understanding of internal displacement has evolved since we were established in 1998. Back then, there was no single agency that was responsible for collecting and analyzing data on internal displacement and providing this crucial information to responders on the ground and to governments. And so, therefore, there was no real global measure of this phenomenon. Internal displacement, as you may recall, back then was mostly talked about in relation to armed conflict and violence. It was considered one of the key products of conflict. And it was considered primarily from a humanitarian perspective. It was looked at as a crisis that required first and foremost an emergency response. In 1998, IDMC was reporting primarily on internal displacement happening in conflict contexts, and we were reporting numbers of IDPs in roughly 25, 30 countries. 10 years later, in 2008, our understanding and our approach radically shifted as we expanded our global monitoring function and started reporting the first global estimates on internal displacement linked with sudden onset disasters. Over then the course of the following 10 years, we added to these sudden onset disasters, we added drought to this list of hazards that became included in our figures. And we've continued ever since to expand the evidence base through case study work, through methodological development, to gradually understand better and better how displacement comes about as a result of both sudden and slow onset disasters across the world. Now, what our monitoring shows today, and you'll see it in this report, but also in our global report, the grid, and all of the case study work that we publish on a regular basis, is that displacement now more than often comes about as a result of a combination of factors that are increasingly overlapping and becoming more and more interconnected, so much so that it's very difficult today to be able to say that a particular internal displacement situation is only caused by a single hazard. And today, of course, climate change is very much at the center of all of our analyses, and we consider it, of course, a key driver and an accelerator of these interconnected hazards. So from 25 countries that we were reporting on back in 1998, we now monitor over 200 countries and territories across the world. Our annual global report on internal displacement, the grid, is recognized now as the global measure of this phenomenon. We see it very much as a temperature gauge on the state of the world. But it's also a measure of how countries are faring when it comes to preventing and finding effective solutions to this phenomenon. So the report that we'll be discussing in this morning's session is the first comprehensive report on disaster-related internal displacement in the Asia-Pacific region, which is the region most affected by disaster displacement. We're particularly proud of the fact that this report is the product of a partnership, a collaboration between IDMC and the Asia Development Bank, the ADB that is represented today by Samuel Tumiwa and his colleagues who've flown in from Manila to be with us today. This is a partnership that shows not just how far IDMC has come as an institution, but also how successfully I think we as a community, as a global community, have been in advancing the notion that internal displacement needs to be considered a development priority as much as, if not more than, a purely humanitarian one. So you'll see that the report presents the scale, but also the main drivers, the risks, the impacts of internal displacement across a number of countries. And it also shows and showcases some of the solutions that have been analyzed by IDMC and its partners. One of the main takeaways is that disaster displacement does place an potentially unmanageable burden on governments, and if unaddressed, will constitute a significant barrier to development. So we believe that this report makes a compelling case for investing in better prevention, in better responses, and of course in sustainable solutions. And importantly, I think it also provides a historical baseline. This is 12 years of data that we have collated and compiled into a single report and are publishing for the first time. So this does constitute a baseline upon which we're going to be able to monitor countries' progress in the future. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, when the report was presented in Brisbane recently at the Interministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, it was very much received as such by the countries who were present. So we'll be hearing this morning from our distinguished panel of speakers about the findings of the report, but also looking at what can be done to address this issue from the local to the global level. I will be introducing all our panelists very shortly. But before I do so, we will be hearing from Mr. Thomas Wagner from the Permanent Delegation of the European Union to the UN here in Geneva, who will be giving a keynote address to all of you. And then you will hear from my colleague Vicente Anzellini, who will present briefly, not too briefly, but we'll be presenting the findings of the report, and then we will move to the panel discussion. I'd also like to say this morning's session will focus very much on the findings of the report. This afternoon, for those of you who will be staying with us, will be a series of technical panels to unpack some of the key issues linked to disaster displacement monitoring and reporting. We'll be looking at new approaches to risk analysis and risk modeling. We'll also be looking at some of the solutions and good practices that have been recorded across the world, and how we can all learn from them. So do stay with us if you are able to for this afternoon's session. Without further ado, I'm happy to hand over to Ambassador Thomas Wagner for the keynote speech. Mr. Wagner.
Good morning to all of you. First, I would like to thank IDMC, through you, Alexandra, and the Asian Development Bank for organizing this timely conference and giving me the floor, both as a representative of the EU Observatory, but also as the EU chair of the platform of disaster displacement, which we are holding now for the next year, and which is an important mandate we have. Recent events, such as the tropical cyclone Madol in Japan or the Australian bushfires 2 years ago, showed that disaster-induced displacement is likely to exacerbate in the Asia-Pacific region, a region that remains highly vulnerable to climate change. I'm honored to deliver this keynote speech in the presence of two organizations that constitute key pillars and partners of EU's scaled-up policy on climate and displacement in the region. While we have a strong partnership with IDMC in the Pacific on data, research, and capacity building of national and regional governments that we will extend to other regions, the Asian Development Bank is a strong ally to help governments prepare and catalyze public and private funding for climate-friendly infrastructure projects across Southeast Asia. So disaster displacement is of paramount importance to the EU and takes a prominent role in EU programming in the Asia-Pacific region. And let me take the example of the recent floods in Pakistan, which devastating impact has affected 33 million and destroyed livelihoods, crops and infrastructures, forcing more than 10 million persons to leave their homes. So the EU and its member states have taken swift action and pledged a total humanitarian funding of over 123 million euros. This new funding aims to address urgent needs such as shelter, water, food, health, protection, education, and cash assistance in the most affected areas of the country. Whereas humanitarian support is saving lives and remains essential, we also recognize that initiatives addressing the developmental challenges must be scaled up to avoid these disasters and to address the longer-term impacts. Our strong engagement for climate resilience is clearly reflected in EU development funding. Given the disproportionate impact of climate change on the world's most vulnerable people, the EU's commitment is to dedicate 30% of development funds to actions related to the climate and environmental crisis. In Pakistan, again, as an example, the EU will address the constraints to green economic growth to improve livelihoods of the most vulnerable households, including displacement-affected communities. Capacity building of renewable energy sources and integrated water management and security are priorities. These actions are also expected to contribute to addressing climate-induced mobility. We have two EU policies to address these issues. First, we have recently updated our policy in a Commission staff working document entitled Addressing Displacement and Migration Related to Disasters, Climate Change and Environmental Degradation. The document takes stock of the progress made so far and provides an overview and assessment of the policies, instruments and practices implemented and promoted by the EU. This publication coincided with our wish to take a more active role on the global scene, and this is why we have taken up the chair of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, called PDD. We intend to use this momentum to steer the global coordination to provide greater protection to people displaced in the context of disasters. So both our internal thinking and priorities as chair for the PDD show great resemblance. Our efforts will focus on three main axes. First of all, we will seek to strengthen specific coordinated actions to better respond to disaster and climate-related displacement. All this in a coordinated and comprehensive way. This will include a focus on research and data collection and analysis, as well as support for capacity building and policy development initiative in this area. It is important to invest in a better understanding of the vulnerabilities that people are facing and have best practices on how to address these. We have found a strong partner and ally in IDMC to do precisely that. This often boils down to an issue of capacity. There is a big need to build capacities to allow countries to meet their obligations under international frameworks and to support their populations. Countries need support, technology sharing, sharing of best practices to respond to the climate challenge. The challenge that we are facing requires also funds and investments. How can we lever fundraising efforts to address the needs on the ground and support those in need of funds to access climate funding? And initiatives such as a catalytic green financial facility can be real game changers. Our joint support through the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility can help ASEAN member states fight climate change, improve air, soil and water quality, and improve environmental protection. We need more initiatives like that also in other parts of the world. Secondly, we believe that it will be important to strengthen advocacy on disaster displacement, including by bringing it to the table of multilateral processes, starting with the COP27 that will take place next month. We need to have a significant shift in the way we address this, a permanent feature. The sooner we integrate the work on climate and displacement into all other aspects of our work in development, the stronger our positions will be. And we have the pleasure to have here Robert Piper, whom I see here, whose very noble task is to streamline the key question of IDPs in the UN system. And we are actually very happy to be a partner in that process, to support him both politically and through practical means. And your office, Robert, will equally play an important role to include disaster displacement into the broader development agenda of countries affected. And we look forward to working with you on that issue in the coming year. And finally, our third priority will be to address the institutional future of the platform on disaster displacement during our mandate, including its current setting, its functioning modalities, and its objectives. This will include a joint reflection exercise on options towards achieving the financial sustainability of the PDD in the future, as well as its capacity to support partner countries in addressing disaster and climate-related displacement. Finding a solution for what we are up against requires strong allies. All speakers today are key partners regarding disaster displacement, and I seize this opportunity to thank them for their engagement and their initiatives. And again, to IDMC, our thanks and wishes for an excellent conference today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for this keynote, your keynote remarks, and thank you very much also in turn. I would like to thank the EU for our excellent partnership over the years. As you said, we've been working very closely with the EU on a project in the Pacific region with our partner IOM and the Platform on Disaster Displacement. But I think we see you, as, of course, also as a very strong political ally on this agenda. So thank you also for the reminder of your important work and support to the PDD and satellite initiatives around that. Without further ado, I would like to introduce now our speakers who are here with us today and who are going to be reacting to the findings of our report. I will introduce the speakers now and invite you all to please come and sit here on the stage before we then move to the presentation of the report itself. So if I may please kindly invite you to take a seat, and you'll be able to follow the presentation of the report by looking at the screens here in front. Please. Ambassador Gorely, nice to see you. Please.
Thank you.
I think we thought we would do it in order of speaking, which would put you towards the second to last, Robert. Okay. I thought, sorry, my team would have. So Ambassador Honsei, please, here, and then Sam here, and then Sam here, and then yes, and then Ugochi and Robert. Thank you. Okay. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome you all today for this panel discussion, and I'm very grateful that you could make the time to join us today in person. Very happy that we've managed to squeeze this event in before potentially a new wave of COVID-19, so fingers crossed that we'll all stay away from it. So starting with you, Ambassador Amanda Gorely, very nice to have you with us. Ambassador Gorely is the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Australia to the UN here in Geneva. Welcome. Australia, the government of Australia is also one of the IDMC's strongest partners, particularly when it comes to our work on disaster and climate-related displacement. Next, we have His Excellency Mr. Kozo Honsei, Ambassador and Deputy Permanent Representative of Japan to the UN in Geneva. Welcome, Ambassador Honsei. Very, very glad to have you with us today. Next to Ambassador Honsei, we have Mr. Samuel Tumiwa, who is Advisor and Chief of Fragile and Conflict-Affected Situations, Sustainable Development and Climate Change at the Asian Development Bank. As I said, Sam has just flown in from Manila to be with us today, and Sam is also one of the newest members of IDMC's advisory group. So welcome to Geneva, Sam. Great to have you here. Excuse me, my COVID cough is still not completely over. Next, we have Ms. Ugochi Daniels, Deputy Director General of IOM here in Geneva. Real pleasure to have you with us. IOM is, of course, one of IDMC's strongest and longest standing partners, on this issue. We started, when I mentioned that we started monitoring and reporting on the first global estimates of disaster displacement back in 2008, and I believe already in those early days our key, if not only partner at the global level at the time was IOM. So also very, very happy to have you with us today. And then last but not least, Mr. Robert Piper, Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on Solutions to Internal Displacement. Many of you know Robert. Of course, we're working very closely with Robert and his office as a follow-up to the the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on internal displacement, and also looking forward to hearing where all of this fits in your agenda and your priorities, Robert. So welcome, and thanks for joining us. Before we move to the discussion, I'm now going to hand over to Vicente Anzellini, who will briefly present the findings of the report. Over to you.
Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to be here and present the findings of our latest report on disaster displacement in Asia and the Pacific. As Alexandra said, this was a very ambitious stocktake of analysis of 12 years of data. We have never actually embarked in such a longer trends analysis for this critical region in terms of disaster displacement. And here are the trends in this chart. And what you can see is that disaster displacement has seen significant variations over the years. With some outliers, particularly 2010. I think it's worth mentioning this one in particular because on top of floods in China, a major contributor of disaster displacement that year was the Pakistan floods. And here we are again facing a major disaster that triggered mass displacement. So if we were to add this disaster on top of many other disasters that are ongoing in the region and are about to happen as the cyclone season is about to arrive in the Pacific, we may be also going for another very big year that probably is going to be higher than the previous several years. And overall, what you can also see is that disaster displacement in this region is not necessarily declining. For the period analyzed, an estimated 225.3 million internal displacements of movements were recorded. And this represents around 78% of the global total disaster displacement, making this region the most affected worldwide. And this map shows you the geographical footprint of disaster displacement. Some countries, including the People's Republic of China, the Philippines, India, and Pakistan, really jumping to the eye for their scale. These countries, it's a combination of high population exposure, but also high hazard intensity. For example, in the Philippines, the typhoons, the same goes for China, India with the monsoons, earthquakes, and also Pakistan, as I said before. But these should not necessarily overshadow countries that are lesser in scale, and yet the impact can be significant when looked at proportional to their population and capacity to respond. And this is particularly relevant for small island states in the Pacific. Since we started recording, actually monitoring disaster displacement in 2008, we really started taking every single event and associating a specific hazard to it. And this allows us to break down the figures by hazard type. And I thought relevant to share this with you today because it really shows that weather-related hazards triggered the majority of the displacement. This is not surprising because, of course, these hazards are much more frequent than geophysical events, and the scale of geophysical events triggering displacement should not be neglected because this region is actually a disaster hotspot in this regard. 90% of the earthquakes globally take place in the Asia and Pacific region. That is also home to around 75% of the active volcanoes that have triggered mass displacement with significant impacts in the long term. Back to weather-related, if we break that down further, what we can see is that floods are the main contributor of the overall trends, followed by storms. And what I find particularly interesting about storms is that if you break that down further, major storms, tropical cyclones, and also known as typhoons in some parts of Asia and Pacific, have been major contributors. And this is also a story of resilience for the region, because many of these displacements are actually preemptive evacuations conducted and led by governments ahead of their landfall. So this really is also testimony of the increased efforts that have been put in strengthening resilience across the region. Due to time constraints, I cannot dive into the sub-regional overviews, but this is, of course, a call to everyone to have a look, because we're doing the same type of analysis that I just presented at the rather regional level by different sub-regions, and showing, of course, the proportion. As you can see, East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia being the major contributors of the overall trends, followed by Central and West Asia and the Pacific. And again, but the Pacific may be 0.4% of the total, yet this is normal, of course. It's about, compared to populations of China and India, of course, it's going to be lesser scale, yet the impacts can be significant. So we're really breaking down this analysis for all these sub-regions, and also highlighting examples of good practice. Another interesting thing that we can do with the data that we have collected is to understand the seasonal nature of disasters and displacement. And this is what you see in this chart for floods in blue and for storms in purple. And this is extremely interesting results, because you can really see that, for example, floods have a seasonality that behaves very different than storms. No? Storms is mostly due to the cyclone season in South Asia that tends to take place between March and April. Then there's another typhoon season between July and October, and as I said before, upcoming cyclone season in the Pacific, where you see another peak there at the end of the year. Floods, on the contrary, being mostly concentrated between May and August. Around 90% of the total flood-related displacement is concentrated in this particular period of the year, mostly due to the monsoon seasons in South Asia and East Asia. Now, what about climate change? The problem that we're facing right now is that there is not enough data to really be able to correlate properly climate anomalies and disaster displacement. So we would need at least 30 years of data to be able to run sound analysis. But what we can do is to apply risk modeling, and there's going to be an entire session this afternoon about that. But in collaboration with ETH Zurich, we did this analysis that what shows basically is two different scenarios from now till the end of the century. What would happen if we would go down a path of a more unsustainable scenario, is what you see in the dark blue line. It's a scenario if we continue basically with the same level of greenhouse gas emissions and unsustainable urban development, among others. Disaster displacement, and this is for floods actually in particular, flood-related displacement risk is set to change by more than 300%. If we were to apply a more sustainable scenario, lowering significantly greenhouse gas emissions, we would be talking more or less about the same levels of disaster displacement. Regardless of the scenario, the wake-up call here is clear. More needs to be done to address the issue. Another chapter of this report represented a major contribution in terms of analyzing the social and economic impacts of displacement, to go beyond the numbers and the scale. And we put together in our global report this figure of $21 billion in terms of economic impacts of internal displacement, a highly conservative figure. And the challenge that we're facing for Asia and Pacific is that there's not enough data to actually put together these estimates. But we know, of course, that the social and economic impacts of displacement touch on every aspect of life that you see listed out in this different in this chart, no? From livelihoods to health, education, etc. Internal displacement can have long-lasting impacts. And model estimates show that for every day IDPs are unable to work as a result of displacement, 275.5 million could be lost across the region. And again, this is conservative. In order to we zoomed in this analysis and put together some case studies in different countries, and I wanted to share with you a couple of findings. A case study that we did in Jakarta in Indonesia showed that over half of the people who had to leave their homes in 2021 in Jakarta had been displaced more than once, and that the average monthly income for displaced respondents was 1/3 of that non-displaced. The same goes for their cost. 1 in 4 respondents say they had to pay to repair their home, spending the equivalent to over a month of their average income. And this is a really interesting finding because it shows how affected communities actually are reabsorbing the costs and the impacts of disaster displacement. And only 47% of the respondents continue their income generating activity during displacement. We also did a case study in Nepal, in a specific district in Nepal, that was interesting because it was associated with the displacement triggered by the Gorkha earthquake back in 2015. So it's really a case study on protracted displacement, and what it shows is that 22% of the displaced respondents lost all their income that year, but that 64% of them were still unemployed 7 years later. And 44% of the non-displaced respondents reported additional expenses after the arrival of IDPs. And this last finding really shows that the economic impacts on displacement not only affect IDPs, but also host communities. Another case study that was interesting in this is that it was looking more at slow onset phenomenon, sea level rise in Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, showed that 17% of the people displaced by sea level rise between 2018 and 19 reported having lost their income entirely upon their displacement, and a staggering 88% remained without income for more than a year. And nowadays, the average value of their homes is lower than the non-displaced respondents. And a last case study that I'm not going to enter into the details, but it's extremely interesting, is in Vanuatu, that confirmed basically many of the findings that we have already put together in different publications in IDMC, is that displacement tends to exacerbate pre-existing vulnerabilities and reinforce social inequalities. Women, children, the elderly, people with disabilities are often at higher risk of neglect and violence than their non-displaced counterparts. So we also, again, need to go beyond just basically the monetary cost and understand the different implications for different populations. And the last chapter of this report also assessed progress in terms of policy development and the way forward, proposing a series of recommendations. And the region is in a good position to do this kind of analysis also moving forward. And we analyze basically the status of the Sendai framework 7 years on. And the Sendai framework calls for monitoring disaster displacement and actually has a series of indicators that allows us to do it. The problem being, and in order not to enter into each of the details of this chart, is that most of the countries are not reporting on key indicators that refer to displacement up until now. That doesn't mean, however, that countries can, of course, strengthen their efforts in doing so. The number of people evacuated, the number of people displaced during and after disasters, the number of houses destroyed, which is a key metric to us to understand disaster displacement, and also the duration of displacement, remain mostly unaccounted for. This is not a comprehensive analysis. It just looks at some countries, but already the findings show that much more needs to be done in terms of monitoring this phenomenon. And the same goes for disaggregating the data. The data should not only be disaggregated by hazard, it should be disaggregated by location, by gender, by age, etc. And what you can see in the gray bars is really that out of the countries assessed, 2/3 of the governments do not publish or endorse data on disaster displacement as such. So in the process of aggregating them, aggregating the different data sets, we come up with a figure, but much more can be done at the national level to really reinforce this issue. And only 3 of the assessed countries collect data that is partially disaggregated by sex and age. So much more to be done again, but this holds huge potential, especially as the Sendai Monitor provides a good tool for this. Now, having said all of this on the more technical end, that doesn't mean, however, that countries have recognized disaster displacement in different policies. So once more, not a comprehensive assessment, but out of the 23 countries that we analyzed, 87% recognize displacement caused by disasters, and 2/3 include measures to prevent future displacement and to address durable solutions. And there is actually an ongoing momentum in really strengthening this issue. So there is, again, the potential for this, to reinforce this. And this is my last slide that basically calls for more investment in sustainable development. As Alexandra just said before, is not only a humanitarian challenge, it is a sustainable development challenge. And early action and early warning will definitely make a difference and lower the cost, of humanitarian aid provision. Regional collaboration is there, is gaining even more momentum, and this should continue to really foster knowledge sharing, capacity support, etc. And as IDMC, of course, we cannot wrap up a report without doing a clear call for more robust data on this phenomenon, because as you can see, much more can be done for analyzing trends, for analyzing the seasonality. And this type of analysis can be downscaled at the national, sub-national level if we have the right data. So of course, this is a last point to really call for stronger efforts in this issue. So I will leave it there, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vicente, for this excellent presentation. I forgot to properly introduce Vicente to all of you, but Vicente is one of the lead authors of this report, and he also coordinates IDMC's global report on internal displacement. I'd like to also congratulate and thank my team for the immense amount of work that's gone into this report, and of course Sam's team in Manila for working with us on it. I think what this presentation shows, even though, as you said, there's still not enough data. We've only been reporting on disaster displacement globally for the past 15 years, and the data that we have is only really robust for the last 12 years, which is a trend line that is too short in order to draw conclusions regarding historical trends, let alone future trends. But I think what it does show, and what all this data does show, is that disaster displacement, contrary to popular belief that was the case a decade ago, is not something that is resolved easily. It is not something that is necessarily less political and less complicated than conflict-related displacement. What we're seeing here from one case study to the next is that disaster displacement tends to also become protracted. It can have long-lasting effects on individuals, on communities, and on countries themselves. And as one of the slides showed, it also has a number of knock-on effects on different development sectors, from housing to health to education. So again, I don't need to make that point yet again, but I do think that it does make a compelling case for looking at it from a sustainable development perspective. At the same time, I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the region. As Vicente said, there's been a lot of investment by governments when it comes to evacuations and better planning and data collection that I think we can all learn from. So now, turning to our panelists for today. Again, welcome to all of you, and thank you for being with us. I'd like to start with Ambassador Gorely from the Government of Australia's perspective. As I said, you've been strong supporters of this agenda. You've supported IDMC's work. Could you tell us a little bit more what your reaction to this report is, and how your government is responding to the needs of people displaced by disasters across the region, but also in Australia itself? And are there promising examples that you can share with us today?
Right. Okay, well, thank you very much, and Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be part of this illustrious panel today. And disaster risk reduction and displacement during disasters is a high priority for the Australian government, and that's why we did co-fund this report with the ADB, and it is part of our ongoing partnership with IDMC. And as we've just heard from the presentation, the report highlights the drivers and impacts of internal displacement across our region and the value of strengthened regional cooperation. And it is absolutely the case that evidence-based disaggregated data is central to informing investments on the prevention of and solutions to displacement. My last two postings were the Philippines and New Zealand, and so this report really hits home for me. I was in the Philippines and part of the response to Super Typhoon Haiyan, and saw very much on the ground the impact of that typhoon on the population there. The Marawi siege, which is a man-made disaster, nonetheless resulted in the displacement of an entire town or city in Mindanao. And I happened to be in Christchurch in February 2011 when the big earthquake hit there, and saw firsthand, well, firstly was a part of the impact of the earthquake, felt it firsthand, but also saw the massive displacement that happened there when large parts of that city became really uninhabitable. So this report is timely and provides very important data to inform preparedness and decision making. And as we just heard, there are over 225 million internal displacements reported in the region over the last decade, most often triggered by weather events. And in fact, as I speak here today in my home state of Victoria, we are grappling with yet another flood crisis. We're entering into the third El Niño weather pattern over the coming summer, and already large parts of the country are underwater. So these disasters continue to impact our communities every single day. And of course, disasters and climate change exacerbate existing threats to human security and intersect with the ongoing drivers of human mobility, environmental factors, economic, energy issues, health issues, and also food security. And each of these impacts diminish the resilience of our communities. They stall sustainable development and also impact on prosperity and livelihoods. And we know that climate change is the single greatest threat in the to the livelihood, security and well-being of the peoples of the Pacific. That's why Australia is working with our Indo-Pacific neighbours to strengthen disaster and climate resilience, including recently, last month, we co-hosted the Asia-Pacific Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in Brisbane. And I really commend to you, if you haven't read it already, the co-chair's report, which contains a number of very important calls to action. We're also working very closely with our multilateral partners, including UNHCR and IOM and UNDRR, to assist and protect people impacted by displacement and to support durable solutions. We're an active member of the steering group of the Platform for Disaster Displacement, and up until March 22, we co-chaired the UNFCCC's Task Force for Displacement with Tuvalu. We particularly acknowledge the importance of disaster risk reduction efforts which are inclusive, gender responsive, and reflect the needs of everyone in the community. And I note that the report reinforces that. And this, we believe, is critical for effective and equitable policies and resilient communities. And so we're therefore funding a number of important programs to include better inclusivity. This includes the Women's Resilience to Disasters program with UN Women, which works with women and girls in Fiji, Kiribati and Vanuatu to strengthen resilience to disasters and hazards and gender-responsive institutions. And we're also working with UNDRR on the Women's International Network on Disaster Risk Reduction in the Asia Pacific, which supports a practitioner network promoting women's decision-making and leadership during disasters. Local communities, of course, are first responders when disasters strike, and they bring critical context and local expertise to disaster management. So Australia's disaster responses are centred on supporting Pacific leaders to deliver on the priorities of their communities, which we did recently in the Tongan volcano response earlier in the year. We're also working on the Shifting the Power Coalition, through which Pacific women and people with disabilities are supported with technical knowledge and resources to lead in humanitarian responses. The coalition partners have reached 100,000 women through their members, and their work has contributed to women-led responses to Tropical Cyclone Yasa recently in Fiji. So I won't go on for much longer because we have a number of panellists to get through, but as the Indo-Pacific region grapples with the latest flurry of disasters, including fires, floods, earthquakes, volcanoes, the messages that this report conveys seem to be more important than ever. So I commend you for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And thank you for these remarks and for reminding us also of the importance of gender-responsive programming and particular attention given to people living with disabilities. This tends to be overlooked, particularly in crisis context. And what we have shown from other research is that particularly people with disabilities in a disaster setting will tend to get left behind, and therefore paying particular attention, I think, to their needs is going to be also key to then finding more sustainable solutions. So it will be interesting perhaps to come back to you if we have time for a second round to maybe hear a little bit more about what has worked very, very well and what kind of advice you could give to all of us for prioritizing this type of programming in the future. But thank you very much for these remarks and these thoughts. Ambassador Honsei, I'm turning to you as well right now to also hear from the government of Japan's perspective on this issue. As Australia, the government of Japan is also involved in responding and in investing in better responses to disasters and disaster displacement in the Asia-Pacific region, also including in Japan itself. So could you also share with us what some of your experiences have been, if there are also some promising practices that you can share with us today on those investments? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alexandra, Amanda, and Samuel, and Ugochi, and Robert. Yes, they are my colleagues, panelists, and excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank you for inviting me for today's this panel. And I'd like to congratulate ADB and IDMC on the launch of the report. The relevant and timeless of this report are clear from the fact that there are 80.8 million people displaced in the Asia Pacific every year on average. And that this represents 78% of global disaster displacement. In addition to conflict, climate change, and COVID-19, frequent and severe natural disasters are having a serious impact on the internal displacement, and the international community needs to work together to address this issue. In this regard, we welcome the UN Secretary General's action agenda on international displacement and appointment of Special Advisor, Mr. Robert Piper. This report also represents a positive step in the right direction. The world is now witnessing serious disaster associated with climate change. The recent situation in Pakistan is one example. Japan also suffers damage caused by heavy rain disaster every year. And according to the Japan Meteorological Agency, the probability of the kind of heavy rainfall events in only seen every 15 years is now about 3.3 times greater due to the global warming in Japan. As the report shows, in terms of disaster, weather-related hazards are the main causes of displacement. But displacement is also caused by geographic hazards such as earthquake, tsunami, volcano eruption, as Amanda shows before. And the social vulnerability people, including women, children, the elder, and the people with disabilities, are most significantly impacted by displacement. The Japanese government has incorporated gender perspectives in its disaster management policies. As a specific example of this, the government has included the perspective of gender equality in guidelines in disaster response it has prepared for local governments, which are at the front line of Japan's disaster response. These guidelines cover various stages of disaster preparedness, ranging from initial response and life in shelter to recovery and reconstruction. Response during each of these stages is treated from the perspective of gender equality. In addition, we promote the active participation of women and a diverse range of people in disaster prevention and mitigation. Disaster displacement is already eroding development gains in Asia and the Pacific and threaten the long-term perspective of the region. We cannot escape natural disaster, but we can minimize the damage they cause and protect citizens from future displacement. In this aim, Japan has set out and played a leading role in global efforts to enhancing resilience through its international cooperation. We have been providing cooperation to enhance early warning capabilities of the global community over the past decades to mitigate the impacts of natural disasters. Of course, we provide emergency assistance when disaster happens. We dispatch emergency teams and provide relief items and financial assistance. In the case of Pakistan's recent devastating flood, at the request of the government, Japan immediately provided emergency relief goods, such as tents and plastic sheets. Also, in response to the flash appeal issued in September, Japan has extended emergency grant aid of $7 million in order to support the humanitarian activities of multiple international organizations there. From the midterm perspective, we have been promoting pre-disaster investment in our international cooperation on the Asia-Pacific region. Over the 5 years from the inception of 2015, the Sendai Framework of Disaster Risk Reduction until 2020, JICA provided $317 million in technical assistance, $883 million in grants, and $7 billion in loans to promote DRR in developing countries. The support has covered a wide range of areas from pre-disaster investment to early recovery from crisis. In effect, we have taken a multi-layered approach to assistance that aims to both prevent internal displacement and seek solutions to these issues. At the policy level, we assisted with designing master plans and regulatory frameworks. For example, in Indonesia, JICA has been conducting a technical cooperation project to enhance Indonesia's government institutional capacity in terms of planning and implementing of the country's flood control master plan. We have also collaborated with UNDRR in jointly providing technical assistance to Jordan and Lebanon to assist the formulation of their respective disaster reduction strategies. In the case of hazard monitoring and risk assessment, Japan has assisted with the installation of a tsunami early warning system in the Indian Ocean in collaboration with UNESCO. Our recent technical cooperation project included in providing a tsunami alert system in Indonesia and Vanuatu. On the resilient infrastructure, we see well constructed with Japan. The ODA saved the capital city of the Maldives from 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. Regarding the education and the public awareness, Japan has provided assistance for school education on tsunami risk reduction that evacuation drills in Asia Pacific in cooperation with the UNDP. Furthermore, we have been arranging public awareness event with UNDRR and offering a study course on tsunami risk reduction for women leaders of small islands developing states together with UNITAR. Finally, in terms of finance, Japan has been providing standby credit facilities to disaster-prone countries such as Fiji and the Philippines. Standby credit facilities contingency funds made available to those countries as a response to the financial demand of post-disaster recovery, including creating an environment that is conducive to the return of IDPs. At the same time, we need technical assistance to enhance their disaster response capabilities. These are some of the views in which Japan has been contributing to address kind of issues covered in the report. This report provides us with useful information and that will be a great help as we consider future cooperation. For its part, Japan will be pleasured to share its knowledge and expertise to mitigate further displacement in the Asia-Pacific region. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you very much. I think it's very interesting to hear just how much investment has already been made across the region by Japan's international cooperation, and particularly when it comes to capacity strengthening. I think there's a lot that we can learn there from the range of issues on which countries are going to need additional capacity strengthening in the coming years. You talked about strengthening on DRR and early warning systems. You talked about normative development as well, sort of ensuring that national and subnational policies are responsive to the needs of particular vulnerable groups. And you mentioned the experience of Japan itself. I think I saw it for myself as well when I traveled to Japan, to Fukushima in 2019, and saw just how important community resilience and the role that local communities played in providing the support both before the disaster struck, but even after in the years that followed, particularly to women and other people who required not just physical support but also psychological support in the aftermath of the disaster. You talked about financing, so again I think it would be great at some point to be able to compile all these experiences, document them more systematically, and this is something that we'll be discussing in this afternoon's sessions when it comes to best practice and knowledge sharing from one country to another. Thank you very much for those insights, and again we may come back to you afterwards with another question. Turning now to Samuel. Sam, you're representing today the Asian Development Bank, and we're delighted, I think, here as a community here in Geneva to hear from a regional bank how you're looking at the issue of internal displacement and what are the different connections that you're making internally with the different technical sectors of the bank, how you've managed to even put it on the agenda inside the bank. This is something that I think we can certainly learn from. So if you could just say a few words about what that process has been for taking us to where we are today and to this partnership with IDMC, but a more definitive interest of ADB to work on displacement in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra, and thank you also to IDMC for partnering with us and including us in the advisory group. Thank you for the report and the collaboration report. I want to highlight Stephen Goldfinch, who was a team leader from the ADB side on this report. So congratulations to us all for the development of this report. Also, it's an honor to be on this panel with distinguished Australia and Japan being very important shareholders of ADB and development partners, and also IOM and the United Nations, of course, organization we have a lot to learn from with this topic. As I get to your question, I think, internally in ADB and across the board, when it was asked, why is a development bank engaging in what is traditionally a humanitarian issue, right? And one of the things that has come out of this study is that clearly, yes, although internal displacement requires a humanitarian response initially, it is fundamentally a development issue. If you go back and we look at the past half century, development in Asia has been incredible, right? The millions of people have been brought out of poverty in Asia has been incredible. It's been unprecedented, the growth. Countries that were least developed are now middle income, and so there's been a lot of development in Asia. But if we do not address the issue of displacement, we do not address the issues of the fragilities that are in our region, it's going to undermine a lot of the development that has taken place in our region. And that's very, very important for us to look at. I think we look at so our president likes to say the battle for climate change will be won or lost in Asia because of the percentage of greenhouse gas emissions growth in our region. But not only that, it's an existential issue. If we look a little bit, if we dig down a little bit into our region, of course, we talked about the numbers that came out in the report. And the Pacific is not a huge number, but the issue of climate change, the issue of displacement is an existential issue for the Pacific. It's not, it's a disaster. Well, do these people, do these communities, do these countries, can they still exist going forward in the next 20, 30 years? So it's a huge issue. It's just not a numbers game. And it's not good enough to do development. It's not good enough to provide loans or grants, but it is really an existential issue for them. If you look at the largest cities in the world, I think 10 of the world's largest cities are in Asia and the Pacific, right? Many of them are coastal cities. We saw the case study in Jakarta. I'm from Jakarta. It's sinking at 2 millimeters. The ambassador was there in Jakarta. It's sinking at 2 millimeters per year. And if you look at the amount of people from the major cities in Shanghai, Jakarta, maybe even Bangkok and others, Manila, that are going to be displaced because of sea level rise and climate change, going into the future, this is going to be a huge issue. So the report talks about the past, and we're good because we're looking at empirical evidence, but going forward, these are the types of things that are keeping us awake at night at the Asian Development Bank, and we need to address these issues. So we're looking forward. Perhaps when we talk about, there are two things that we're trying to do in the Asian Development Bank, and this is, on the one hand, there are upstream issues that we can address and that we can work on. And then there's also, and these upstream issues are with regard to disaster risk reduction, disaster preparedness. When people think about development banks, we always think about, it's the projects that they fund, it's the projects that they fund. In fact, in my view, the projects we fund is the third most important thing that we do. The most important thing that we do is the policy dialogue that we have with these countries. I mean, the volume that development banks have and the volume of finances we have actually buys us a big place at the table to have a policy dialogue with the countries. So we have to take advantage of that. We should not forget that. And talking about disaster risk preparedness, disaster risk reduction, all these types of things are very, very important to prevent disasters. The second thing is then about capacity. Right? We should be then worried about the capacity building, funding capacity requirements. Only then do we really need to talk about lending and the money. And so when we talk about, so we are actually well placed to address some of the disaster displacement issues in our region. And that's why when we talk to our management believes that there is a role for us to play in this. We've also put in two very important pieces of policy in ADB to respond to this. We have revised our disaster and emergency assistance policy last year. And in the past, there was a very clear line between development assistance and humanitarian assistance, and that this line shall never be crossed. In fact, it's not a dark line, it's a gray area between humanitarian assistance and development assistance. And early action by the ADB in this area is also very important in responding. So in the past, where internally in ADB we think of, there was the Typhoon Haiyan, it's a humanitarian issue, we'll get involved when it comes to reconstruction. Well, building the bridge that connects that area to allow humanitarian assistance is already development work. Bringing in the electricity so the clinics can start working again, that's already a development issue. So we need to learn to do that earlier on as an institution. And so those are, and so that's part of our disaster and emergency assistance policy. We've also put together an action plan for fragile and conflict-affected situations and small island developing states, the team that I lead. And because we look at the issue of displacement, we look at the issue of disasters. Yeah, the Philippines has 49 million people displaced, but it has some capacity to deal with it. The fragile countries are the ones that we also need to pay special attention to, where they are not as capable of addressing these external threats to the system, whether it be disaster, whether it be the COVID-19 pandemic. So we at ADB are also very focused on the least developed and most fragile and most, what's the term? The most vulnerable countries. So on both these sides, we're looking forward. And so amongst the development banks, we've put together, we have now a working group of all the development banks on economic migration and forced displacement. And we're learning from each other and sharing these lessons learned. Last week was the World Bank fall meetings. Over 100, in our case, FCAS, or in the World Bank parlance, FCV practitioners got together to discuss these issues. And so it is becoming a bigger and bigger issue amongst the MDBs. Now, I can't speak for all of us, but at least for us, we're very committed to this. And internally in ADB also, we're trying to get this to become part of the internal psyche of the Asian Development Bank. In the past, yes, there were a group of people like Stephen who works on disaster risk reduction that deal with this type of stuff, but we need to mainstream this. We need to make this part of our day-to-day thinking, just like gender is part of our day-to-day thinking, just like safeguards, environmental, indigenous person safeguard is part of our main day-to-day thinking in our operations. We need to make this mainstreamed. So there's a lot of challenges for us to go forward. We're very thankful to be invited to be part of the IDMC and its advisory group, because we have much to learn from the group. And so, so yeah, thank you very much. And I also know just we have some additional funding to continue this research and this work going forward, perhaps this year. And so we continue to look forward to working on it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sam. Very interesting. I think there are going to be a lot of follow-up questions to you, but well noted your focus on the policy dialogue with governments, and of course capacity support to them, and particularly to those most fragile and vulnerable countries. I think it would be really interesting to hear a little bit more from you later as to how you managed to actually, in a sense, shift the kind of internal incentive structure, as it were, to really advance this agenda and change the internal psyche, as you mention it, because I can imagine that it's not always a comfortable policy dialogue that you were having with the country. So from our perspective, at least from IDMC's perspective, we're always thinking about what kind of new arguments we can make, what kind of evidence is needed to push those political arguments through. I'm sure that, you say you're going to learn from us, but we're going to learn a lot from you as well. So I'll come back to you in a few minutes. Now turning to Ms. Daniels, to Ugochi, great to have you with us. Representing IOM on this panel. As we've said, IOM is one of the sort of key UN agencies dedicated to this issue. You've worked a lot on the data provision side through our collaboration with the DTM. We've also done some joint research together, and of course, as an operational agency, I think you're one of the main responders when it comes to disaster contexts. So anyway, it would be great to hear from you about IOM's extensive policy and operational experience globally, but also regionally, and to hear a little bit more about the opportunities that IOM has identified to better help measure the scale and the impacts of internal displacement, including through the development of new indicators. Vicente talked about the indicators that are needed to monitor progress under Sendai. This is something that we've been working on with IOM. If you could say a few words about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. And like all of the other distinguished panelists, I congratulate you and ADB on the report. It's a pleasure to be here, and good morning to everyone. So maybe I'll pick up where my colleague from ADB stopped, which is the developmental impact of displacement. And from the report, we know that about 780 billion as of 2021, which is the equivalent of 2.5% of the regional gross domestic product, was the cost of displacement. That's huge. And then in the worst climate change scenario, and Vicente had presented two tracks, so to speak. So in the worst case, these losses are going to increase to 1.4 trillion by 2060, and will disproportionately affect the economies of specific small island states. So the existential threat you had mentioned, Tomiko, with regard to small island states. But this is just the tip of the iceberg and does not include the level and vulnerability, exposure, and low adaptive capacities of the affected countries. So everybody's talked about recent developments in Pakistan. I was there recently. I won't go through the numbers on this, but something that the Minister of Planning said to me, because we went on an aerial site visit of the flood-affected areas, is that the flood affected the least developed parts of the country where people were living in mud houses. So if you're living in a mud house when a massive flood happens, you're going to be displaced. So it's disaster risk, of course, critically important, but the real impact has to do with the vulnerability of those that are affected. And low adaptive capacity, limited economic development policies, and DRR are really the key drivers of the costs of disaster and displacement in such situations. So with regard to your question on data, of course, I'm from IOM, so I'm going to start off by saying yes. The scale and impact of the disasters does need to be measured, but with purpose, right? So we already know that these are major drivers of forced movements, and your IDMC's risk analysis shows that it's going to increase, right? It's only an issue of rate. So what we saw, again, Vicente, going back to your slide, is even in the best case scenario, there's still going to be increasing displacement. I'd also like to point out that the figures are critically important for bringing attention to the issue, but what we've seen, unfortunately, is it can also be instrumentalized and support alarmist scenarios of mass south-north migration into affluent countries, and this has fueled xenophobia. It's also important, and Alexandra, you talked about this, the limitations of the data, uncertainty of forecasts, and overcoming them to go beyond the headline numbers and really understanding what's happening beneath with regard to displacement and migration, and to support operations that effectively address environmental risks and impacts. So we do need to have a really nuanced understanding, and we have to be even more careful when investigating the linkage between conflict, environmental change, and mobility, which are complex and highly context-driven. And it's important that we address these knowledge gaps. So yes to data, but within this, within this context. The second point I'd like to make is with regard to opportunities to strengthen our data collection and analysis on disaster displacement. And first and foremost is increased interest of member states on data and evidence to inform better policies. You had mentioned, the convening power of ADB with regard to policy discussions. Right now, IOM across the street that way, is holding the International Dialogue on Migration, on Climate Change, Food Insecurity, and Food Mobility. And the data discussions that we're having here are a perfect complement to what's happening in these discussions with member states. So we definitely see governments, as well as communities, advancing their preparedness, early warning, and response plans. And they are demanding evidence to support their efforts. Now, Alexandra, you had talked about IDMC and IOM working together. So the Sendai Framework Monitor is key for governmental and non-governmental counterparts to develop displacement-related metrics among the indicators that countries can use to monitor progress against the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction. And this will serve to better measure the scale and impact of disaster placement globally. A public call for consultation to review these draft indicators was issued on 19th of October and remains open until 11th of November. So I hope all of you, or I encourage all of you, to be part of this review process. As IOM, we also support governments in strengthening capacity to collect, analyze, and use existing displacement data. So the whole point about capacity building, and I promise you, my speech is not meant to reinforce everything he has said, but it's nice that it complements that way. And with IDMC and the PDD, we're supporting national disaster management offices in the Pacific to improve their national data collection systems, ultimately to better understand, prevent, and respond to disaster displacement. And a similar approach is being rolled out for 6 island states in cooperation with the Organization of East Caribbean States, so OECS. Okay, so now tapping into modern technologies, another opportunity to have more accurate, standardized, and harmonized data. So, as we know, advancements in technology have been impressive, including COVID-19 turbocharged digitalization with opportunities for better data collection and analysis, big data, broader access to internet and mobile phones, crowdsourcing, crowd seeding, geospatial technology, global positioning systems, geographic information systems, remote sensing, and social media monitoring are all vehicles that can support our data efforts. Of course, we recognize that these opportunities come with limitations and need careful ethical considerations around digital identity, data protection, and disinformation. But the opportunities are exponential. And what we've seen, or what we've done as IOM, this is in the Sahel with our transhumance tracking tool, which prepares communities for early or large seasonal transhumance movements, is that using satellite imagery, we've piloted remote sensing work to identify movements, patterns, and climate variation along key transhumance corridors between Chad and CAR, which really goes to the point about early action and anticipatory action, and it helps identify hotspots so that remedial or early action can be taken to reduce the likelihood of conflict and therefore reduce, hopefully prevent displacement, but we know more needs to be done. As IOM, we're playing a key role in providing crucial internal displacement and solutions data to inform policymaking. And we're going to use technology to carefully adjust our tools, such as the DTM, which you mentioned. And DTM provides essential baseline IDP numbers and their needs, as well as area-level data for analysis of displacement drivers and obstacles to solutions. Almost 85% of humanitarian needs overviews and humanitarian response plans are supported by data, by IOM's data, and through the DTM, we inform coherent and effective durable solutions interventions. So tools such as the quality of return assessments enable us to chart the progress of IDPs in locations towards the achievement of durable solutions. Okay, so my final point today is really about strengthening the quality of solutions data, because having the data on disaster displacement critical and important, but if we're really going to be getting to solutions, we need to enhance internal displacement data by going beyond counting the numbers and defining how many of them are actually able to come out of situations of displacement. As IOM, we've been collecting this data for several years with a focus on returns from abroad and within countries. Globally, we've counted at least 33 million post-displacement returnees in 2021. In the first 6 months of this year alone, this number has already exceeded 40 million, including 33 million internal returnees. And while we can't yet claim universal coverage of all returns post-displacement around the world for specific countries, including in Asia Pacific, IOM's data is nationally representative and shows amazing insights. So yesterday, we released the data, last year's data for Libya, where we observed 50% of IDP stock reduction as compared to 2020. And this is a very important observation, which helps us to define our policies and actions in support of solutions. And now coming back to Asia Pacific, we have national coverage data for Afghanistan, which shows that return continued despite the political crisis of last year. And if you compare the number of IDPs that we registered in the country with the number of returnees, you'll notice that the number of returnees post-internal displacement is twice as many as the IDP stock. So more granular studies point to the specific needs of returnees, their socioeconomic characteristics, vulnerabilities, and resilience. Thanks to funding from the EU, IOM has developed a unique approach towards monitoring situations of returnees through longitudinal studies. It's a program called REMAP, and the comprehensive data allows us to speak about the situation of female returnees, children, but also to look at the drivers which led those persons to leave their homes, but more importantly, to come back. So let me conclude by saying that we all know the opportunities to adequately measure the scale and impact of disasters for greater prevention, preparedness, response, and resilience of communities. However, while it's essential to prevent a worse future, it's equally important to strengthen the quality of solutions data and invest in data to support effective mitigation and climate adaptation policies in order to save lives, money, and development gains. Seeking solutions for displaced persons doesn't just mean addressing the needs for those on the move or about to move, but it also means helping them to stay and adapt despite rising climate volatility. And for those who've decided to return, we need to better quantify if the returns are successful and sustainable. Investing in IDP data for solutions can result in significant preparation for an unpredictable future. And more importantly, this will enable individual choice towards human mobility. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Ugochi, you've said so many things. I just want to pick up on a couple. The first point that you made about the kind of socioeconomic dimension of disaster displacement, I think it's key. It's very much aligned with what Sam was saying beforehand, and that is something that we've seen across the board. How typically those who will face more protracted forms of displacement and higher levels of needs and severity of needs are those who already had pre-existing social and economic vulnerabilities beforehand, and that is undeniable, and we need to bear it in mind, not just at the prevention stage and in the data collection efforts, but also when we start thinking about longer term solutions. And the second point that you made, and I'm very glad that you've put so much emphasis on data. There are so many things that you've said, from the misuse of data. It's true that there are a lot of alarmist scenarios out there, a lot of sensationalism attached to, human mobility numbers in general. I think what this report shows, in fact, is that the majority of disaster displacement, at least based on the numbers that we know today, is internal displacement. We're not talking about cross-border movement, a massive, south to north migration here. So that, for me, strengthens the case that we're all making that it has to be looked at from a development perspective and from a kind of system strengthening perspective at the national and subnational level. You talked a lot about, innovative tools. Absolutely, we've at IDMC, maybe this afternoon that will come up in some of the panels, the very promising partnerships that we've developed with the likes of Facebook and others that can be very helpful in just getting a sense of scale. But it's when it comes down to the needs and the responses that we need much more granular data. And so that my last point, which will be a great segue into Robert's intervention, is really about solutions relevant data. I think what we've seen, and maybe my team will correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong, is that even in the best of cases, in the higher income countries that we're looking at in this region and across the world, even in those best case scenarios, we are looking at disaster displacement data that typically trails off after a certain number of weeks, or at best maybe 3 to 6 months. Data collection does not continue over time, and yet we are looking at displacement situations that are continuing over time. And so better understanding the needs of specific sort of socio-economically vulnerable groups within an IDP caseload is already difficult, but understanding how those needs evolve over time and how one would have to adjust responses accordingly is, I think, one of the key knowledge gaps that we're facing right now. So thank you for supporting our calls for better data, but as you said, for the right kind of data as well. So now turning to Robert. So Robert, you have solutions and development solutions to internal displacement at the heart of your mandate. And you have also made the prevention of future displacement crises and the focus on disasters and the impacts of climate change one of the priorities of your mandate. Could you share with us what your plans are in this regard? Whether this type of report is something that you will be using in shaping those priorities, and perhaps if you do have the time and a few ideas, if you could say what kind of data and evidence you think are going to be critical for advancing your agenda and supporting your priorities. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alex, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. It's been quite an illuminating morning already, so I don't have a lot to offer, but in addition, but let me share a few thoughts. Congratulations on the report. I'm reminded I spent 5 years in Nepal as the head of the UN, and a big piece of my time there I dedicated to getting ready for the earthquake because we knew it was coming. And we created this thing called the Nepal Risk Reduction Consortium. The Asian Development Bank joined us. It had elements. Ugo was with me. In fact, we were both in the UN country team. We had pieces around infrastructure, schools and hospital retrofitting. We had pieces around community preparedness. a lot on institutional capacity, getting the kind of relief infrastructure ready and so forth. We learned a lot from that. I learned a lot about the difficulty of getting investors in preparedness and prevention, even when the economic and human arguments were so powerful. I learned a lot about how the most vulnerable people are always, we keep hearing this, impacted much more than the less vulnerable by disasters. We heard today how, was it 64% of those Nepalis are still unemployed 7 years later, which is a staggering statistic that we really shouldn't lose sight of. I learned a lot about the importance of local government. I mean, the big killer in Nepal was the building code and the lack of enforcement of the building code. And at the time, Nepal had not had a local election for over a decade because of this sort of civil war. And so there was this very important missing part of government, of someone who cared about checking whether the school emergency exits were being done, checking whether the masons were this very small, very important act with rebars to make sure that they met the basic building code in terms of building standards. The role of local government just cannot be overestimated. And of course, I learned a lot about the predictability of all this stuff, even earthquakes. Very, very predictable. We couldn't have given you the month, of course, but we knew we were overdue, and we're overdue for a bigger one in Nepal than the one that we've had so far, but this was the precursor. And so a lot of this is desperately predictable, which makes our failure to act on it kind of even more of a crime. And so I think just I'm very much reminded of this work in Nepal. Of course, I left in 2012, 2015. The earthquake hit. The week before the earthquake, we inaugurated a sort of relief distribution center at the airport in Kathmandu. So just to kind of illustrate the fact that we knew this thing was coming. There were no huge surprises, and we tried to do what we could with the constraints that we had. So today, 7 years later, I have a small team that began in the last few weeks. As many of you will be aware, the Secretary General commissioned this high-level panel of eminent persons to look at this internal displacement issue. He knew we needed to think outside the box. This high-level panel looked at the data, looked at the trend lines. They could see this dramatic increase in the number of internally displaced, many of them driven by climate and disasters, of course. And they could not see a similar process of moving people out of displacement. The line just kept going up. We weren't very good at getting people out of displacement. We're not very good, as Ugo mentioned, at measuring and tracking their departure out of displacement either. And this high-level panel, I think, made a number of very important observations about the need, above all, for governments to take full responsibility for this internal displacement issue, for the need of all of society to come together to deal with something this complex, for the need for the UN development system, the IFIs in particular, to come in behind the internal displacement issue, to call into the private sector to think innovatively about what it's going to take, but above all, and to act preventatively, of course, to figure out ways of reducing the numbers. The Secretary General of the UN then launched his own action plan, which is essentially derived from the high-level panel and identifies areas that the UN needs to lift its performance, whether it's around prevention, whether it's around the response and protection of people once prevention fails, or indeed whether it's around solutions and the need to kind of move people out of their displacement as quickly as possible. And that's sort of at the core of my business, but I coordinate also the plan in general. The Secretary General has also, in his action plan, really put responsibility on the UN's development leadership to manage this. So we have, for those of you that are familiar, we have humanitarian coordinators in the field, and we have resident coordinators in the field who are responsible for development, responsible for that relationship with government, harnessing that partnership with the international financial institutions. And the resident coordinator of the UN has been charged by the Secretary General to really make this a priority, reflecting some of the observations that have been made this morning about the need for the development system to really step up to the plate. In my office, our initial focus is on solutions, trying to figure out how do you move people out of displacement, working with governments, working with their development partners. It's fairly clear to me that the challenge is much less a technical and a capacity one than it is a coordination challenge, a political challenge, and certainly a financing challenge, which follows from the above. And Ugo spoke a lot about the importance of data solutions. Putting together accompanying IDPs, if they make a decision vis-a-vis their future, and it's always got to be their decision of whether they return, whether they stay, whether they resettle. Pulling together and accompanying them under government leadership requires a tremendous number of moving parts to come together, from livelihoods to services to legal and documentation issues to the political enabling environment to the investment in their infrastructure, from the local at the center to the federal level, if you will, in a country like Somalia or Ethiopia, to the very, very local. Tremendous number of moving parts, and they must come together under government leadership. There's kind of no shortcut. And so the first challenge we've really been struck by is the sheer complexity of the coordination task. The second is the political piece of it. Of course, there's a tremendous amount of sensitivity around solutions, pathways, whether the IDPs will get compensation, how you defend favoring a particular population against others, perhaps in the immediate neighborhood, questions of identity and whether they can still be recognized as from somewhere else, even if they've chosen to settle somewhere, security issues, the mediation issues, working with local communities. So there's a second basket of very complex political issues. And then, of course, there is the financing part. And here, solutions cost money. Investment in communities that have been abandoned maybe years ago that need to be resuscitated, new neighborhoods in urban centers that are going to be the home for internally displaced people resolving their displacement, issues of compensation, etc. It all costs money. So we're really trying to figure out then how do we build pathways? We've identified a dozen or so countries where we will really focus over the next 24 months to accompany those governments and their development partners in developing these pathways on solutions that address these key hurdles around the coordination, around the political, around the financing, rather than sort of coming up with a sort of magical, technical silver bullet, which we don't think is out there. We think it's more complicated in a sense than that. But that's trying to bring down the number of IDPs that are out there already. The second piece, and Alex talked about, is trying to reduce tomorrow's internally displaced persons. And today we've had a very powerful kind of reminder of what is driving some of these really big numbers. Of course, conflict and wars are pushing the numbers up. In some parts of the world, crime and violence is having devastating consequences on where people feel safe to live. And of course, climate change and disasters is increasingly the big driver. And it's becoming harder. I think Alex made this point of separating out the role of climate versus violence, if you will, and explaining why people are moving. I was for a few years the UN regional coordinator for the Sahel, and this was a while ago, I already found it was really very difficult to try and extract what was going on here, the extent to which it was a resource a kind of competition driven by climate change, or the extent to which it was to do with civil, social relations and so forth. So on the climate piece, I don't think we can do a lot, honestly, in a couple of years on the Security Council and some of those big reform questions. But where we do think we can make a difference is around particularly the climate part. There is a very clear relationship between climate change and mobility. We have seen a lot of good analysis. It's more and more coming that identifies the fact that many people around the globe will have to move due to climate change over the coming 2 to 3 decades. Estimates in north of 200 million plus people that will need to move. And the big challenge for our governments and our development partners like the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank is to make sure that this movement is a managed part of the development process, and we never let it become an internal displacement crisis. It's a hell of a lot better for the individuals concerned. It's a lot, of course, better economically. It's a much smarter way of managing a process of change that is already programmed into our societies. So we will be working with some of the vertical funds, the climate adaptation people, looking at those high-risk countries, and we don't have enough data, by the way, to sort of really zoom in on those countries with the highest risk of climate-related displacement, and analyzing their adaptation strategies and looking at who's helping these governments to address this issue before it becomes a displacement crisis. And we have the vicious circle, of course, which are the highest risk countries are the ones with the weakest capacity to access climate financing. And it's a sort of catch-22 that we also need to overcome. So we're putting a bit of effort on that because that will reduce the numbers as well. The other effort, and I think this morning's report really does speak to this as well, is that we will work with the humanitarian community as well to look at ways in which that early response to a displacement and the preparedness for a disaster can really reduce the duration and the intensity of the displacement in the first place. Nepal wasn't a great success in the sense that we had so much more to do before that earthquake hit that we hadn't achieved. But think of all the things that can be done to reduce the intensity of that displacement. Pre-position materials, thinking through about, of course, locations of where people will move to, insurance schemes that kick in as soon as a kind of climate event triggers, this early preparation work that characterizes many of the most successful. Ukraine, we're seeing, for example, quite strong, robust government systems kind of catching IDPs, the largest number of internally displaced people in the world. So lots can be done on the humanitarian side as well, in the way in which we respond, in the way in which we prepare for a displacement event that will reduce the duration and intensity of the actual displacement itself. We need to get more scientific about that. And preparedness, by the way, it's just one of those things that keeps falling between the cracks. In the United Nations, in many of our organizations, for some reason, no one wants to get into preparedness. No one wants to pay for it. It's not humanitarian, it's not developmental, and it's so important, I think. So maybe we can, out of this also, we can lift up a little bit the status of preparedness in our conversations. But look at those relationships between disaster risk, climate, preparedness, mitigation measures, the risk analysis, and good governance. Good governance that puts duty of care as a priority in terms of governance. All of these things need to come together to deal with these issues around displacement. So let me finish, I think, just with some observations very briefly. I think the recommendations of the report are extremely sound. So we very much support that push for more investment and planning, the national policy frameworks, the risk assessment. The idea of more regional collaboration is a very good idea. I think we do feel we need more sophisticated data. The biggest gap, in my opinion, is the sort of longitudinal data. We don't track, and Ugo also touched on this, we don't track very effectively the sort of fate of a particular family from one year to the next. We heard in Jakarta of families that have been displaced more than once. How many of these flood victims from Pakistan are on their second or third displacement? We mustn't send them back to risk. We need to kind of understand and then factor into their kind of location where to move them with their consent in order for this not to become a sort of permanent cycles. We need much better data tracking the protracted nature of displacement, the cyclical nature for the same people from the same location. And we need more data understanding the impact of a protracted displacement on the status of a family in terms of the chronic vulnerabilities that come with this protracted uncertainty. Kids losing contact with their mother tongue, families being displaced from their communities, the uncertainty of not knowing, of sort of not really being clear where is home, where are you putting down your roots over, in some countries, in some cases, 10 or 20 years. So there's a whole set of data we feel this is fabulous. There's a lot more work to do on data, and there can be a lot more investment. I think, secondly, we need more IFIs like the Asian Development Bank engaging on these issues. Not just post-disaster, which is a little bit less controversial, perhaps, than around post-conflict, of course, when things start to get a little bit bit more sensitive. Around climate mobility, which is, for some countries, also a little bit sensitive. We need the IFIs really on the front line here and helping governments to manage the trade-offs of investments that will provide returns maybe for a future elected government, not this one, figuring out how to reconcile these different timelines and these rewards. And then finally, I think, just a call for this to be approached in as holistic a manner as possible. It's not an original idea, but it's really striking how these different elements must kind of come together in order to deal with an issue like a displacement. It's a development issue. It's a humanitarian issue. It's absolutely a governance issue. It's a financing issue. We need to kind of bring all of these pieces together when we look at an issue like this around risk and displacement. And we need systems that kind of allow that to happen, that are not so heavy that they fall over themselves by the weight of them, but that are light, strategic, but definitely connect the key dots. So thank you. Happy to kind of respond if there are questions. But again, just let me finish where I started, just to say it's a great contribution, and really congrats to ADB and to IDMC for bringing us to where we are today. Thanks, Alex. Back to you.
Thanks a lot, Robert. So many key points that you've just made. I'm not going to try and summarize everything you've said, but the ones I'm taking away are really linked to what you were saying, that it's not so much an issue of capacity than it is political will and financing that goes with that. So it would be really interesting. Maybe there'll be some questions to you about that. How do you incentivize? How do you change that, again, that reward structure that you just talked about, to make sure that we do start investing today for a reward that may not come in the very near future, but that certainly will need to come in the longer term future. This is the issue of why no one is investing in preparedness. I think it's the same reason why no one is really investing in longitudinal data and in that more granular and resource intensive data that is yet so critical for reaching solutions. I'd like to now, I'm just aware of the time, and I am supposed to be keeping time. So we have a few minutes left, and I would like to open the floor to all of you. We've also got a few questions that are coming in from our online participants, but I'd like to thank you all for your very, very insightful remarks. I think we've learned a lot. There's a lot there to digest. So are there any questions to any of the speakers from the floor? I'm seeing Sumbul. Go ahead, Sumbul. And maybe if you could just introduce yourselves before you ask your question. There's a microphone coming here.
Thank you very much for this very, very illuminating discussion, and to you, Alexandra and IDMC, for your foresight, for actually anticipating that this issue is a growing one, because work on this obviously started several years prior to result in this report. Sorry, just to introduce myself, I'm Sumbul Rizvi. I am a principal advisor in internal displacement to High Commissioner Grandi at UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and also the chair of IDMC's advisory group for the moment. My point is is actually trying to unpack the issue of vulnerability that we've talked about, and that's pretty evident that all of us recognize that, including for prevention and response, but noting also that internal displacement and refugee movements These are often people fleeing conflict and violence, and therefore often targeted or not necessarily given their due, even from a core human rights point of view, in places of displacement or places of refuge. And usually the hosting countries are often the most fragile countries from many dimensions. One is, of course, their capability economically, but also because of their location in disaster situations. So what is the role and effort that states could actually be advised to and support? And I go to Sam's point number one, which was one of the great influencing factors of a financial institution like yourselves to influence state policy for the inclusion of IDPs and refugees within their response measures and also in prevention measures. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think I'll maybe take one extra question. Perhaps, Sam, you could keep Sumbo's question in mind for responding. Let me give the floor to Peter here. Peter de Klerk here. Please feel free to switch off my mic when I'm coughing.
Thank you very much. My name is Peter de Klerk. I'm also a member of the IDMC advisory group. I have two questions, and they're related to resources, and they're actually quite closely linked. And one is to Robert, to the ADB colleague, and also to the donors at the table. And that is about the prevention. Even if we make a very convincing business case, and many of us have done that at the country level, whereby it's very clear that investing upfront in a very predictable, pending displacement disaster as a result, for instance, of flooding, it just doesn't stick, particularly with our donor colleagues. And I would like to drill a bit deeper on that. Why is that? Why is it, if we can make that convincing case, look at the human suffering, at the economic suffering, and then the benefits of actually addressing that up front, is it so difficult? Whereas in countries like Somalia, where I've worked, it's perfectly easy to get on an annual basis your money for response to flooding. And you know where it's going to happen, and you know pretty much when and what the consequence would be. The second question is about funding to financing. And Robert, you were talking about pathways. And sort of this is, of course, a bit one of the holy grails of your work and the work we're collectively trying to do. How do we get particularly donors, development actors, IFIs to really invest in fundamentally putting money in the hands of national actors, and particularly governments and states? How do we do that? Why, again, do we stick to solutions so long as part of humanitarian response plans? And again, are donors perfectly willing to do that? At the same time, we don't see the other long-term development actors stepping up to the plate much earlier. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. I'm just going to give the floor to the gentleman just over there. Yeah, there are a lot of hands.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. My name is Riyad Bazia. I'm independent consultant based in Geneva. I'm a civil society activist. I'm former NGOs coordination office in the UN Geneva since more than 20 years ago. Thank you very much. What I want to share with you and raise, yes, Sendai, let me start like that, but it will be concise and brief, certainly. Yeah, Sendai Framework Convention, since 12 years ago, as you mentioned, the analysis of the report. When we was talking on the implemented on the Sendai process here in Geneva, we was talking also about LDC's Congress, Least Development Congress, because it is itself a UN process, international process in the UN, and this Congress, it is every year, and 2011, 2021, and what I want to, as Mr. the panelist for Asian Development Bank, he mentioned also SIDS, a group, small island development states, and we are here to talk about the report in the regional office in Asia and Pacific, and the majority they are island and archipels. But what I want to underline more, LDC is a process, it is itself, there is targeted to support, and there is 13 Asiatic member states who are members, who are still in the LDCs group, and they should be more supported to getting out from the list for the next Congress. This is what I want to mention. As you are also official representative of Asian Development Bank, because there is 2 sessions, because there was cancelled the Congress because of the pandemic, another session maybe next year, how we can to talk more, to prepare more the next Congress. But I want also raise how it could be duplicated, what you are doing, because you said also additional funding, they are still available. How it could be duplicated with other development bank, regional in Africa, in Asia, and also in the International Development Bank under reconstruction, because it's a part of World Bank. Last point I want to raise, it will be raised, yes, and Alexandra, you said everybody wants to learn from everybody. Of course, I appreciate the presence of a Japanese representative with us, such as Australian, and she was with us last meeting. Because Shanghai, it is a Japanese city, such as Hyogo, it is a Japanese city, and they process an environment on Hyogo, such as Kyoto, it is also another, because Geneva city is leading 15th worldwide network of cities until we implement, just before the pandemic, another foundation, an NGO in Geneva, Geneva Cities Hub, which is leading by the former mayor of Geneva City. I will be more happy we can collaborate more with the Japanese cities on this issue and the regional issues with this. Thank you very much.
Very much. I know that there are other hands up, but so that we don't lose track of all the questions, maybe I'm going to hand to you, Sam, if you don't mind, perhaps answering several questions, kill several birds with one stone. There was Sumbul's question, there's this question with the link with the LDC Congress, and then I'll move perhaps on to Peter's question on financing and on the role of donors. And then I also have a question that will be perhaps a little bit more for ambassadors Gorely and Honsei. But Sam, over to you.
Thank you. I think that those are very good questions, and I think in many ways they're related. And I'll be very honest, and I'll be very frank, and maybe not. I think it's as you say, it's a very difficult conversation to have, especially for us when we're lending as opposed to giving grants. And if you put yourself in the position of a finance minister, the finance minister has this much development requirements, this much resources. That minister will be borrowing this much, and the minister will need to then prioritize which projects have the biggest returns, okay? And in fact, that's one of the reasons we have this study, to highlight the economic and financial returns for an investment on prevention. But then it's overlaid by a political angle. Where do you get more political, points? I don't think that doing a DRR program gets you a lot. But when you're out there handing blankets and water, you get political points. It's a difficult thing to do. And for us, when we observe this and we have that conversation, it's difficult because the minister, and also with displaced persons, we've had conversations where, with specific countries where we have this displacement problem in our country, can you help us? Yes, we can, but we only have loan resources. I don't want to borrow for people from other countries coming to our country. So it's difficult. We've done an extraordinary thing thanks to our donors where we've provided significant grant money, $200 million, to one of our member countries to address displaced persons. And we're doing it again. But it's not a sustainable solution. It's a sort of a one-off thing. So these are the conversations I think that we're faced with, just as you are, where we don't have an answer because of the sort of political economy situations of these countries. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. He partly answered a part of Peter's question as well. I don't know if Ugo or Robert, you'd like to come in on Peter's question.
If I may, thank you. One quick reaction to Peter's question. I think, the important is always crowded out by the urgent, and it will always be. So the only way I see us kind of breaking out of this cycle is to force ourselves legislatively to set aside a percentage of of every dollar we spend on response to invest in preparedness and prevention. I don't see any other way around it. And, you know, we spend $8-9 billion a year on peacekeeping. We spend $24 billion a year on humanitarian assistance. You decide is 1% or 5% of the value of that has to be set aside every time we spend a dollar on dealing with the failure to prepare and prevent. You know, I think we should find a mechanism that really actually forces our member states to set aside that money every time. I don't see any way about it. Going around every 6 to 12 months with a begging bowl to try and raise resources, for as you said, it kind of doesn't work. So I think that, for me, some formula like that is where we kind of need a breakthrough. And as far as sort of working through national systems, I think that is a very valid concern. And the more IDP effect, well, yeah, high incidents of IDPs also come with a lot of fragility. Not always. I mean, Colombia's pretty robust. Ukraine's pretty robust. They're at least very high in the IDP numbers, but many of those countries have high degrees of fragility. And it is a vicious circle, as I mentioned, on climate financing too. The places that need it most desperately are the ones with the greatest problems accessing it. So I think we do need to do some accompaniment kind of work. I think that needs to be. I don't think we're just waiting for donors to have a lower and lower risk threshold. Is probably not going to, you know, necessarily get us there fast enough. So I think we need to combine that with a kind of some sort of accompaniment packages that keep everyone a bit happier.
Would you like to come in on this point?
If I can just add to what Robert had said, and yes, I was with Robert in Nepal, but then I went to the Philippines, and for a time in the Philippines, I was the acting resident and humanitarian coordinator, and the government clearly said to us, said to the UN, we want you to converge in Mindanao and address the peace, development, and humanitarian issues that Mindanao had at the same time. And so we came up with something called a convergence strategy, bringing together the full capacity of the system, but which satisfied the requirement of the government. But then what became a challenge for us is, how do we then fund that? And it goes all the way back to everything we said at the World Humanitarian Summit, everything the donors said about the grand bargain. And I called it trying to unscramble the eggs, because we then had to say, okay, for this part of the strategy, we'll go to this type of funding, and here we'll go for this type. And it's just the significant fragmentation and the transaction costs. So to the point about like a mandatory fee to support prevention, but fundamentally it's the holistic approach. It's also the point about accompanying IDPs and the way we divvy things up. Another example, I won't mention the country, where a local governor wants to support returns for his people, because he says keeping them in camps is an assault to their dignity. There's violence, there's smuggling, human smuggling, trafficking, everything. And the humanitarians are saying, we will not support you because of principles of independence and neutrality and impartiality, which are very valuable principles, but do not enable the system to accompany the government. So there's still a lot on the coordination end that needs to be sorted out. There's still a lot on how to access financing. If you look at Somalia, that has, dealing with drought, has the funding coming in to support the drought, and the government is saying, but we are not getting any development funding. You know, how are we going to be able to prevent anything happening subsequently? So I just wanted to highlight that, because when we talk about how we're going to get to solutions, it's not anything new. I mean, it's all been identified. It's for us to be able to actually do it. And then my final point on the 200 million, that's the World Bank report, the 200 million who are expected to move between now and 2050. Yes, Alexandra, most of it is internal. But the report also says that 80% of that can be prevented by upholding Paris and by investments in adaptation. So the solution to get to the solution is actually there. Okay.
Thanks very much, Ugo. We had promised some closing remarks from all the panelists, but what I suggest, given that we've already run over time, and I would just like to give the floor just for a couple of minutes to our two ambassadors here. There's a question that's come from our audience online, from Ambassador Botora, who used to be the permanent representative here for Ethiopia, who's calling in from Addis, and it says, you know, are there, in the examples that you both gave of Australia and Japan's investments in the region, is there perhaps one innovative program or initiative that served to address all the issues that we've mentioned today in the most comprehensive way possible, where it combined, you know, the right levels of, the right types of funding, it broke down the right kinds of silos, and it served to address the needs of the most vulnerable? Can you think of one example? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Look, I mean, I can't instantly think of one example, but I'm sure that there are some very good examples that have been reflected in our practice, particularly in the Pacific, given the number of disasters that have played out there over the last few years. But I mean, one thing I really wanted to emphasise, and anyone who's been directly involved at government level in responding to crises will know how incredibly complex and political it is. And, you know, there's sort of a view in our system that the government, and you're talking multi-level government, you know, 3 layers of government in Australia, has 3 days maximum to get it right. That's after 3 days, that's when the population and the media will turn against you. And you're not going to get it right in 3 days without having done the work beforehand, the preparation, and all of the things that Robert mentioned in terms of preparation are absolutely critical, including something that I've seen work really effectively in New Zealand and increasingly in Australia, is around self-sufficiency in a crisis as well, and telling the population you're going to have to look after yourself for up to 7 days without any direct aid from the government, and having them in that mindset and able to do the things that they can do to assist them to cope with a crisis. One thing, you know, in response to your question, why don't these changes and preparedness and lessons actually stick? When I went to Tacloban in the Philippines a couple of years after Haiyan, I expected to see a devastated city with, you know, no one living in the area where the actual incident had claimed many, many lives. I was completely wrong. You could not even tell that the disaster had happened, because notwithstanding all of the efforts to rebuild housing in less prone areas, to create alternative livelihoods and all of that sort of thing, human nature being what it is, they moved immediately back into the same areas because that was where they saw their livelihoods as being best served. So unless you're putting significant economic incentives there, and that happens in Australia as well. People continue to build houses on floodplains, and that's because it's cheap. And, you know, unless governments can put in place really effective incentives, plus rules and laws to ensure that if you are in that sort of prone area, you're building a house that is going to withstand flooding. And that's getting more and more difficult to do given the unprecedented nature of the climate impacts that we're facing. then you're always going to have humans, you know, going to the place where they think they can best support their families and earn a living.
Thanks, a very good point. Ambassador Honsei, do you have any final words for us?
So I just want to, refer to some my experience. 2011, there was a flood in Bangkok. We had made a master plan for how to control flood problem, but the Thailand government didn't adapt that kind of our master plan because of their priorities was different from ours. So it totally depends on the recipient countries and the developing countries to prioritize their some kind of contingency plan and to some extent some kind of anticipatory measures is more expensive than usual infrastructure investment, and recipient country have to recognize that kind of higher some kind of preparatory some kind of measures, more expensive, but it will reduce some kind of, for example, climate change disaster. And regarding Sendai framework, is if I remember well, next year in May there is midterm reviews in New York, and also for the next COP meeting on climate change will be discuss the issues of some kind of finance project of adaptations to other LDCs and small islands countries. So we'd like to follow up those some kind of a discussion. But in any case, we have provided our concessional loan towards Peru also, not only for the Asian and Pacific region. And if other Asian countries or other African countries are interested in our program, I said that we are ready to respond to those kind of requirement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm afraid we don't have time for more, so I'd like to thank you for your patience. Sorry that we've gone a little bit over time. I'm glad that we ended with the last few interventions on this issue of prevention and investments towards prevention. I'm sure we'll be touching on it much more again in this afternoon's sessions. We have dedicated panels to talk about risk assessments and risk modeling, but we'll also have a panel to look at good practices from around the world. So hopefully we can dig a little bit deeper into some where some countries may have got some of it right, at least perhaps not all of it. Thank you very much to all of you. We are serving lunch just outside here. You're welcome to join us, and there'll also be an opportunity for all of you who are interested to interact with my team, with the IDMC team, to better understand some of the methods that have gone into the production of this report, data issues. So do feel free to look them up. They should just be standing out there. Thank you very much. Thank you to the online participants, to all of you for joining us in person. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Have a good rest of the afternoon and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.